Good afternoon. My name is Kendall Gresham with Diversity MBA. I'll be your technical coordinator for today's webinar. Today's webinar presenter will be Dr. Patricia Arredondo. Dr. Arredondo has been a leader in higher education in the DEI consulting space for over 40 years. She has authored texts and articles on the Latinx population, immigrants, women professionals, STEM women faculty, and college students. Her work is grounded in cultural competency and social identity theories. Her work on Latina as resident leaders addresses the aspects of Latina cultural wealth. Dr. Arredondo is the former president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and also a licensed psychologist and the president of the Arredondo Advisory Group. Without further introduction, here is Dr. Arredondo.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and I'm delighted to join Diversity MBA for this webinar today titled A Roadmap to Attract and Retain Latinx Talent. I want to tell you I am currently in Mexico City, and I spend quite a bit of time between Mexico City and Phoenix, which is where I also have a home. But in looking at the respect for land and land acknowledgement, here in Mexico City and throughout Mexico, of course, it's been an indigenous country for centuries, historically. And in Mexico City, where I am located, we still have various indigenous groups, the Otomi, Mixteco, Totonaca, and of course, in the south of Mexico, a lot of Zapotecos. So this is a site of great history and wealth for all of Latin America, but for Mexican people, wealth in terms of cultural wealth and how that translates into lived experiences that have gone worldwide. I also bring this to you, I just share who I am. I'm of Mexican American heritage. I was born in Lorain, Ohio, which is on Lake Erie. My father was an immigrant from Mexico, and my grandmother was a Zapotec Indian from Oaxaca, and my mother was born. My mother was born in the States. So I not only was brought up biculturally and bilingually, but I have studied extensively what the culture is about, and not just the Mexican culture, but other Latinx cultures and their history, because it's part of the US history. So I say that as a way of introducing my comments in this webinar. What we know is that there is a great deal of attention to the Latinx population in the United States because it is the second largest ethnic group in the United States, or the largest ethnic group, if you would, but the second largest, the largest ethnic minority group in the United States. If we want to look at ethnic racial minority groups in the United States under that category, or people of color, more is the current term. So people of color, African Americans, people of Asian Pacific Islander heritage, people of American Indian heritage, and Latinx. Those are still the groups as they are organized in the United States as the quotes, underrepresented groups or people of color groups, but the Latinx are the largest now population-wise in the United States. So we want to make sure we understand that the Latinx talent attraction and retainment requires this intentionality. And I will talk about the kinds of professional networks that are available. There's one very stunning statement that comes from Excelencia in Education, which is an organization based in Washington, D.C., about 15, 16 years old. And Excelencia in Education is a change maker for the educational advancement of Latinx individuals with a lot of research data. And one of the facts that they share on their website is that for the United States to regain the top ranking in the world for college degree attainment, for the US to regain the top ranking in the world for college degree attainment, Latinos will need to earn 6.2 million degrees by 2030. By 2030, that's a huge gap. However, it's a fact, and I think important to for all organizations to attend to the data that's in front of us right now. Besides Excelencia in Education, the Pew Hispanic Research Center is a really great source of facts and data and research about Latinx. So here are a few of the slides on the cultural and demographic context, and then from this I will move into the section on the attraction and retention. But I think it's important to understand the opportunity, which is what we have in front of us. So there are about 60 million Latinx, 18% of the overall population currently in the United States. As you know, Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States. That's counted in this population. And people on the island of Puerto Rico are US citizens. So what is changing right now are more people going to college. In 2013, we began to see a college-going statistic increase for Latinx college students. And therefore, there are more college going, not only at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level. And with that, they also bring what we call immense cultural wealth that I'll also share with you a little bit later. So the cultural wealth and varied skill sets. So intentionality is really what we're talking about. So the term Hispanic continues to be used in the census reports, and so you'll see me going back and forth between the terms Hispanic and Latinx. So the growth in the US, as I pointed out, is really attributed to the growth of this population, particularly between the years 2010 and 2019. It's unclear what this 2020 census will yield, since that was undertaken during COVID, and there has been a real, I think, a lot of fear about reporting being in the US, even if you Word document, which is what the census is about. But you can see some of the data points here. We also know that people report being only one race, and they're not Hispanic. Hispanic is not a race. Hispanic really is a composition, as all the other groups, of ethnic groups. But we know that among the quotes Hispanic Latinx population are people who share mixed heritages. So for myself, I'm indigenous as well as European, based on my father's heritage. My father, who was born in Mexico, but his heritage is more European. My grandmother was Indian, Zapotec Indian woman, and so is her family. So we've got most Latinx people are multiracial individuals. Looking at the map of the United States, we see the top 10 states with the largest Latinx population. There probably have been a few shifts since 2010, but probably not many. If anything, these states have become more populated. And you're not surprised about California and Texas and Florida. And then we move up into Arizona, New Mexico, and that's Illinois, by the way, number 6. So what we want to talk about, the distribution of the population. As I said, that the Latinx have become more college going. that 36% were incoming Latinx freshmen in 2018. And that is a very important fact for all employers, for other institutions of higher ed, because freshmen can go on to graduate school. But what we see is these are busting some of the myths that Latino families do not value education. In fact, we have to remember that the reason people come to this country, whether they're Latinx or from other countries, Haiti, Saudi Arabia, if we want to look at some of the countries, Guatemala, they come for their children's betterment and for their families' betterment. So education is a priority. If we look at a quick demographic slide of the United States, this shows you, of course, that the highest percentage of Latinx in the US are from Mexico, and that's historically been constant. The border is one reason. Another reason is that people in the Southwest, that was Mexico up until 1848. So all of those states were people from Mexico, or what was then Mexico in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I think what people are surprised about is the shift in the Salvadoran population. Cuban population had been the third largest for many years, but the Salvadoran population is very present in the United States and distributed. And the Dominican population in the Northeast, there are a lot of people with heritage from the Dominican Republic. So it's, even though there's a dispersion, there is a concentration in different sectors of the country. So the other important fact for me is to look at the distribution of the K-12 population, or the representation of Latinx in the K-12 population. So if you're really talking about pipelines, we need to start with this kind of pipeline. So 22% of students in K-12 schools are Latinx, and in 7 states, Latinx make up more than 25% of the K-12 population. That's big. And you could see in this map that where some of those states might be. Certainly we know the Southwest is big, again, California and Texas and Arizona. But you can look up north to Oregon. You can look again to the Northeast, and we see that Connecticut has a high percentage of Latinx K-12 students, as does Massachusetts. Massachusetts' growth in population came particularly from the growth of the Latinx population. And then you have New Jersey. So 84% of Hispanic public school students were born in the US, a very, very important fact. So we're not talking about immigrants. We're talking about children born in the US. So the growth of the Latinx population in the US is attributed to childbirth, not to immigration. So this little picture, certainly just tells you the story that 1 in 4 elementary students is Latinx, and they were born in the United States. And so this process of change in the pipeline to education and to employment is already underway. Continuing, 1 in 5 women in the US is a Latina. 1 in 5 women. And 1 in 4 women students, female students in public schools across the nation is a Latina. So what we'll see as well is that Latinas are more college going than their counterparts. More women, more Latinas go to college than Latinos. And in graduate school, more Latinas go into graduate school than Latinos. And so again, this is another myth buster, because for many years people have seen Latinas as being oppressed because they're in a hierarchical structure that is male dominated. But candidly, it's the shift is there in the United States now, and there's perhaps the opportunities, there's the equity, there's the mentoring in schools that is allowing women to, and the families are also open-minded. So we can't think that all families want to keep their daughters at home. Coming from Excelencia in Education and looking at data as it relates to the pipeline for employment, so the pipeline from higher education to employment. Most Latinx individuals start their education in community colleges, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the cost. Two, it allows them to still live closer to home and help the family. And three, they have some cultural or social capital where they are living and have employment while they go to school. So starting at community colleges and gaining an associate degree is the most likely scenario for Latinos and Latinas. They start at the community college, then transfer to four-year educations. Why we saw earlier the high percentage of Latinx in California and in Texas. There are more community colleges in those two states serving Latinx, which then allows them to move on to the California State University system or the UC system. Or in Texas, there are about 4 or 5 systems, university systems, where students from community colleges can go. Florida is another spot, and will show the places where students typically graduate. What's the next fact stat is important, that millennial Latinas with bachelor's or graduate degrees grew to 30% in 2017, outpacing both Latino males and non-Latina females. That's a very important fact. There's a page on Facebook called Latinas Completing Doctorates, Latinas Completing Doctorates. And there you will have a snapshot of Latinas from who are millennials, but also a little older, completing doctorates in a degree in a range of disciplines, including engineering, computing science, psychology, and so forth. The most common undergraduate majors for Latinx students are business, education, architecture, and engineering. So if you are a business that's interested in growing your workforce, connecting with universities that have these programs and a high population of Latinx students, let's say a Hispanic serving institution would be a good place to start. So we have the percent of students that were majoring in these areas. As I say, business has been a long time one of the highest areas of major for Latinx, followed by education. I think actually business has outpaced education quite a bit. And then the social sciences. Since Diversity MBA is in Chicago, we want to also note that there's historically been a large population of Latinx in the Chicagoland area. Originally, they were from Mexico, followed by Puerto Rico, but there are other Latinx ethnic groups in Chicagoland, and you will know that by neighborhoods as well, where the Guatemalan population is situated as one example. So about 1.4 million Latinos reside in the metropolitan Chicago area. comprising 17.4% of the area residents. And you can see that it increased. And my guess is that probably from the 2010 to the 2020 census, we'll be seeing more net growth population from the Latinx population in the United States. But you could see how Latinx attributed to growth in other parts of the country. People are always surprised about the South, but many entry points in the South have been for immigrants to arrive to work in the meatpacking facilities, to work in the textile industry. With Katrina affected New Orleans, Louisiana, many immigrants, Latinx immigrants, worked in the construction field, and they still do. There's quite a bit of construction that you will see led by the Latinx population. So I can take a break for a couple minutes, Kendall, if there's something that, some burning items in the chat that I could attend to.
One moment.
Mm-hmm.
We have a comment just thanking you for dispelling the myth of the Latin population growth that is due to, it says, thank you for dispelling the myth that the Latin population growth is due to immigration versus US born.
Okay.
Hi, Patricia. This is Pam McElvain.
Hi, Pam. Hi there.
Thank you. Hi. So that was my comment. So I thank you for that because I hear that a lot. So looking, at the data, which is incredible, the work that you do, there's the issue based on the population and the growth of the Latino population, both in matriculating from college, entering the workforce. Why don't we see that same reflection of Latinas, both men and women, in management leadership positions in corporate America?
That's a great point, Pam, and there are just, a couple of observations I could surmise. One, it's young in its history of college going. That's one. These new data about the increase in the college-going population at the undergraduate level started to be reported in 2012, 2013. So the pipeline is opening up. So if you see the fact that so many more children are born in the United States, look at the Dreamers as one example. The Dreamers are still fairly young. They've graduated from college, but they're still in that, many of them are still not fully documented. So I think that is one of the barriers to accessing even some common employment in the United States. The other part of it is, I think there has to be some, I'm going to use the word grooming for lack of a better word. There has to be better preparation for businesses to and know these data and know that these individuals exist, and also for Latinx women and men to know that there are more opportunities. So there needs to be more mentorship, more coaching at the college level, more bridging so that they can step into a work situation and then advance. But there's too few. I totally agree with you. And I think there are still perceptions about Latinx individuals as not being English speaking or being immigrants or some deficit attitudes. And therefore there's those deficit attitudes, I think, serve as barriers for individuals being considered for opportunities. And there may be a few more slides that I think will help to address that. So if I'd like to continue, Kendall?
Yes, please continue.
And thank you, Pam. Excuse me. So this visual just gives you the diversity of Latinx in the US. And I'll talk about the term because Latinx is not a term that everyone embraces, even if you are Latina, Latino, but it is a term that's used a lot in the academy. Probably our most visible, currently visible Latinas are Sonia Sotomayor, who's a Chief Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court of Puerto Rican heritage. And then the next is one of my favorite people, Dolores Huerta, who's at the bottom of your screen. Dolores Huerta is a civil rights activist. Many of you are familiar with her work during the labor movement of the farm workers in the 60s, 70s with Cesar Chavez. Dolores Huerta continues to advocate for educational justice. She's based in LA, she's 91, and she's just an amazing woman. So I think the map in the middle with the blue face is indicative of the Latinx in the US and our heritages from all of Mexico, the islands, Latin America, Central America, and so forth. So the great diversity of the population in so many dimensions. The term Hispanic started in about 1970, which is about the time the census started taking note that there were people of Latina, Latino heritage in the United States. Believe me, the census, I think, started counting us in about, I think it was truly 1980. Latina, Latino refers to people from Latin America, meaning it includes Brazil, and it's short for Latino Americano. Then we have a term a lot of you know, Chicano, Chicana, which very much is the Southwest. It comes from the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, California. When I was growing up in Ohio, I was familiar, when in college, familiar with the term Chicana, Chicano, but I didn't feel an affinity to it only because I was from Ohio and not the Southwest. So I think it had a much greater importance for individuals who wanted to express their identities and history. Afro-Latinidad has become a very important word in the discussions among Latinx people, and it talks about our collective cultural identity of Latinos and Latinas of African descent, which is present throughout Mexico, Latin America, and the islands. We just have to give it more presence in our work. And also the fact is that people who are Afro-Latino often get confused, or people see only their skin color. They see they're black and they don't think they're Dominican or Colombiano. So I think there are some other aspects of how people are viewed just visibly who may have an Afro-Latinidad heritage. And then Latinx. Latinx is the term now. It's a gendered, since Spanish is a gendered language, the A and the O are what we call a Romance language. The term emerged as a general, neutral, and non-binary term. And so I think wherever you happen to be located, you may want to decide what is the acceptable term. Pew Hispanic Research Center did some investigations and found that only about 35% of people who are Latina and Latino in the United States like the term or know the term Latinx. So don't be surprised if someone says that's not me. I mean, I'm first Mexican American. You know, I know that the PEN umbrella is Latinx. So when we think about processes for inclusive recruitment and retention of whether it's Latinx college students or are looking at professionals who want to move from one organization to another, we have to have a roadmap to do this work. And I always start out with this little slide that talks about inclusive recruitment and retention as a process. It's not something that you just jump to the hiring, but looking at this as a process, also a process of change for your organization. If you have not historically hired Latinx into professional roles. This may be a change. Hire them as an analyst, hire them in the HR as a HR manager, or as in your law firm. I think this is something to keep in mind, as not always, well, I guess not, people don't always know how to do this. And so I do the roadmap or think about it in this kind of comprehensive way. So I always think there's a preparation phase if you are going to be more intentional about outreaching and hiring Latinx professionals. So I already said it, assess your organizational climate for the readiness. You hate to bring someone in as a token, but know that they in fact have a discipline that they bring with them, they have experiences, and that you want to set them up for success. In your preparation, you also want to look at local connections. You may have to identify people who is going to be accountable. And then I think there needs to be some preparation by gaining cultural competence about the diversity of the Latinx population. I just went through a bunch of slides that shares with you the breadth and the diversity of the Latinx population. We're not a homogeneous group at all. And any myths you have about women and men also have to be challenged. I've mentioned already the mindset, but we also need the cultural acumen within your organization of the Latinidad concept, and familiar with the breadth of Latinx diversity. Avoid using the term qualified and a good fit when you're looking at who you might be outreaching to and recruiting, because what we also know about hiring practices, there's plenty of data that shows, that white candidates more often get hired than candidates of color, whether it's African American or other ethnic groups. And with Latinx individuals, as I talked about Afro Latinidad, they might be Colombian or from Puerto Rico, but they may be visibly Black, and that may not go in their favor in a hiring situation. Remember that not all Latinx speak Spanish, and with such a high percentage born in the United States, I'm second and third generation in the United States, and my children are fourth, and their children are fifth generation. Look at it that way. Spanish isn't spoken at home. It's not going to be passed on, and you can study it in college or in high school, and unless you live in a Spanish-speaking country and become very intentional, it's not going to come easy. And there's often an expectation that because you're a Hernandez or you're a Gomez or Rodriguez, that you come equipped to speak Spanish. I think the other side of the coin is that oftentimes people who are bilingual and speak Spanish are overused for translation or for some other work that isn't compensated in the organization. This happens a lot in hospitals, as one example. So with Latinx, I always say check your implicit biases and assumptions. We've already tried to identify some myths to bust. I think the other biases and assumptions are, that we unfortunately hear in the media sometimes not very positive descriptions that Latinx men belong to gangs and things like that, which don't help in putting a positive approach to Latinx. So the biases and assumptions need to be challenged. So if we're looking at outreach and recruitment resources, I've already mentioned that it's important to form relationships with university programs with high percentages of Latinx students. what we call Hispanic serving institutions, and maybe many of you know about these. There are more than 450 Hispanic serving institutions in the United States. There are a couple in your backyard. There, St. Augustine's is a Hispanic serving institution, and there are a few others in Chicagoland that might have a higher percentage of Latinx enrolled students. It's usually you have to have 25% of your undergraduate students being of Latinx heritage. So that's part of the way it's determined. The important fact here, though, is what we call Hispanic recruiting and Hispanic serving, but also Hispanic graduating. So once they're in, the task is to graduate the students. So there are places where you can post positions for hiring, and I'll share those in a minute. And then you also want to look in national organizations of Latinx fraternities and sororities with a national reach. And those are generally found at some of the Southwest universities. I was at Arizona State as a professor for a few years, and I know we had Latina sororities and Latino fraternities, but you'll see that in the Cal State systems as well. But those become other links to your workplace, your organization. Among some of the national Latinx organizations to consider in position postings and reaching out to are ones that I have here. And the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities is really huge. It's based in San Antonio, but it has an office in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento, California. But at their annual conferences, it's a great place for recruiting. Then you have disciplinary specific organizations such as SHIP. I see NSHIMBA is not on here, but NSHIMBA is the one for business school graduates. The Psychology Association is listed here. And then I see there's, at the top is the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. I chair the board of HE currently, and we are comprised of institutional members, which are both universities and in the private sector. But our association is the Pipeline Association. So we have members who are graduate students at the both master's and doctoral levels and administrators. So it's another resource. We have job postings on our AHI site. SACNAS is probably the oldest STEM organization for the advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in science. It started in 1974, so it's another great resource. ASPIDA started in New York City, another resource for education, and I mentioned Excelencia in education. It's not posted here, but they are a great resource, especially for data, but for connections to opportunities. So in terms of continuing your attracting outreach recruiting plan, I just say create a search plan. Don't just kind of do a random statement that we're going to try to attract more Latinx graduate or college students. Do a broad outreach, and also make sure you have a search committee that is prepared in determining what kind of individual you want, and that you do address your implicit biases around the Latinx population. Always have diversity advocates on your search committee. Most organizations have DE&I task forces these days, and I highly recommend bringing a diversity advocate to your search committee. And how you share your job announcements, of course, and then the language you use, and enlarge the pool, publicizing widely, extending personal invitations. Everyone has networks. I get contacted on a weekly basis. Do you know X, Y, or Z? We have these opportunities open. So make sure you have great networks. And I just want to tout Diversity MBA as being a great resource also for contacts in this space. In your outreach and recruitment, remember that the potential Latinx employee comes to you with a number of intersecting identities. We talked about this before, that it's not one ethnic group that is Latina, Latino, but we have different ethnicities, but also intersecting identities based on sexual orientation, gender identity, the racial part of one's identity, age. And then if you look at the B dimensions, we come from different educational backgrounds or geography. You know, when I used to meet people in Boston, because I lived in Boston for 30 years, people thought I was from the Southwest. And clearly I had not. I grew up in Ohio and spent most of my life in Boston before I went to Arizona. But we have individuals in the B dimensions also with relationship status differences. One thing I have to say that is more in the conversation today is that Latinas are, and especially if you go to college and graduate school, are not marrying, are not entering into marriage as they had when, you know, perhaps there wasn't the college going opportunity in place. So you have Latinas who are single or who are raising children single, and or who are in mixed status relationships. That is, they're from a sexual orientation standpoint, they are in marriages or in relationships as lesbian women or gay men. So I think the Latinx population that is in this professional realm that we're talking about has many of the attributes and experiences now of the white majority population. So just know that sometimes the expectation is that Latinas are very Catholic or Latinos are very Catholic. Well, I mean, religion always fits in, but I also would say don't make those assumptions. When I talk about the intersecting identities of Latinx people, you know, just keeping in mind that people are multiracial, so don't be surprised about that. Also that we have different forces in our lives that have affected us. So individuals, for example, in the last 4 years who were immigrants, even if they were documented immigrants, that had a lot of fear about being swept up in immigration, ICE, you know, intrusions in their workplace, even if they were documented. And there are, you know, there are stories of people who were exported or deported, excuse me, because they were assumed to be here undocumented. So immigration has been a historical force for many Latinx in the United States, but so have the politics of the United States that have had an adverse effect or served as a barrier. So I just have a few more slides to share with you, but I'd like to talk about the Latinx intersecting identities. So we're recognized as people who fit profiles of other professionals in your work environment, number one, and to also do some stereotype breaking, because when I was growing up, the only Latinx people you saw on television were bandits. And so today there's, you know, still I would say not always the most positive profiling. But if you want to take another piece of information as consumers, Latinx are probably contributing $1.3 trillion to the economy in the United States because of our consumerism. So people aren't having families of 5 or 6, but they're still having families of 2 or 3, which is, again, adding to the economic wealth of the United States. The scorecards, I'm not going to have time to go through this, but in the work I do with the organizations, we develop scorecards for each phase of your outreach and recruitment, interviewing, hiring and negotiations, and retention. And these scorecards have some best practices that you can use, for example, in your outreach and recruitment plans. I've mentioned some of these organizations. That are they on your plan for outreach and recruitment? Do you have a go-to list? And do you conduct your outreach at regional and national conferences, personal calls? So this is kind of it's a checklist, it's a scorecard. And then you talk, inventory yourselves on whether this is in place and how important it is to you. As I said, in terms of screening, don't label candidates as most promising. If you have a diversity search and outreach program, please involve them and the Chief Diversity Officer. I'm a consultant in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and I often say is request diversity statements from candidates if you're recruiting them. What is their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, whether they're Latinx, white, African American, and so forth. Just know how they commit to your diversity work. Interview schedule, just a couple of things to keep in mind to prepare and train interviewers. And given where you are, if you have partnerships with different Latinx organizations, to perhaps introduce candidates to Latinx community representatives, especially if they're coming from another part of the country. Retention. Of course, the thorough onboarding process, a mentorship program, perhaps an employee resource group that's Latinx that can support networking and welcoming. And then also, we talk about high potential programs in businesses and organizations, really assessing the Latinx talent even before that person is hired. Is this a person who has a potential, as Pam brought up, to move into senior administration, to the C-suite? Really begin to cultivate and identify that person's acumen for leadership roles. And if they do have bilingual capabilities, respect both bilingual and cultural capabilities. I talked earlier about cultural wealth, and there's there's more and more research about Latinx cultural wealth. This is one study by 3 researchers that was published in 2018, and they talk about Latinx cultural wealth community coming from the community. So it's community cultural wealth. And what I think is important about it is to look at the asset side here of all of these boxes. It's aspirational capital, which I think is really, really important, is that the individuals aspire because of their family's aspirations. I think whoever's on this call who's of Latino heritage knows what their family had to do to support their aspirations for higher education. And we look at that also as familial capital wealth. Your family is a great resource when you have to rely on someone to support you through some difficult times. So many of us have familial capital wealth of how we know how to navigate networks and systems. And what's called, I think, also resistant capital wealth and knowledge and skills developed through challenging inequality. The inequities still in schools and where Latinx students go in those major cities or systems, there are inequities with 80% of those students going to public schools. There are going to be inequities in their lives, except that those are inequities that oftentimes students supersede in order to advance, that they supersede and their family supports them. So the Latinx cultural wealth is, coming from knowledge of the culture of your background. Some conocimientos refers to some proverbs you may know. Navigational, remaining hopeful about the future. And one of the things about, I think, a lot of ethnic racial minorities in the United States is this what I call the resistance. We're able to operate in multiple cultures. We're not seen as members of the majority white culture, but we know it because we lived in it and we have to navigate it throughout our lives. So that kind of, there's a concept, walking the borderlands. We walk the borderlands as people of color, and then persevering and then knowing both languages. There are many values that Latinx people bring. I mean, personally, some of these values begin to change with generations, but there may be ones depending on how close your networks are to your grandparents and parents, if they were grounded in these values of caring and humility, friendliness, being empathetic, and also maintaining harmony. I think people that I've learned growing up about maintaining harmony. So we've talked a little bit about the retention resources already. And whose responsibility is it to bring Latinx talent? Well, I think leadership from the top, whether it's you're the top of your organization, the CEO, the divisional leadership in your organization. But you can't always rely on the Latinx leaders or professionals in your organization to do the work for you. All leaders are responsible. And I think the important thing here is some of the demographics we talked about, the geography of the Latinx population in the United States, that it's very dispersed, especially among those top 10 states. So this is the quote I like to use that talks about Latinx people walking in borderlands, always on the border. You're in one culture and you step into another one, but you're in all cultures all the time. So that's from the famous Gloria Anzaldúa. So I want to thank you and really appreciate the opportunity to share this information on this webinar. And thank you to Pam McElwain, our fearless leader of Diversity MBA. This has been wonderful for me to bring this to you. So Kendall, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Arredondo. I do want everyone to know that you are a fabulous expert and thought leader, author of 8 books and growing, professor in esteemed universities, as well as previously presidents of universities. So this is actually an opportunity to introduce an expert to you in the event that you guys want to tap in to her expertise. So I thank you humbly, Dr. Arredondo, for your sharing of this incredible insight.
Thank you. I want to add that I'm also on the board of directors of Diversity MBA and co-chair the review committee, the editorial board for the Diversity Business Review, just to also tout those 2 aspects of Pam's organization, Pam McElwain's organization. Thank you, Pam.
Sorry, I was muted here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. I was muted here. I was gonna say thank you, everyone, for sharing your afternoon with us, and thank you, Kendall, for monitoring the technicals. Thank you. All right, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.